Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into some really fascinating research. It looks like infrastructure on the surface, but it actually tells a bigger story about politics, economics, and, well, engineering success. We're focusing on power loss. Electricity that's generated, but just kind of vanishes before it gets to homes and businesses around the world. And our main focus today, our mission, if you like, is to break down this really rigorous statistical model. It's not just measuring power loss now, but predicting it decades into the future for every country. The study itself, it's quite comprehensive. It's called Power Transmission and Distributions Losses, a model based on available empirical data and future trends for all countries globally.
Yeah. So before we jump into the model itself, maybe let's quickly frame the problem, T&D grid power loss, that's transmission and distribution loss.
Right. It's the energy that just doesn't make it all the way. Globally, you're typically looking at, say, 4% to maybe 15% of everything generated.
But that number, it hides two different things, doesn't it? It really does. First, there's the technical side. That's just physics. You can't avoid it completely. You've got line losses, resistance in the wires, basically. Gets worse with higher current, higher temperatures. And then you have transformer losses. Some are fixed, the iron losses just keeping the transformer magnetized. Others, the copper losses, depend on how much power is actually flowing through. But crucially, and this is what the study confirms, if you see losses creeping above that 15% mark, that's usually not just physics anymore.
Ah, okay. So what is it then?
Well, that's where non-technical factors tend to dominate. Things like energy theft, illegal connections, sometimes poor policy decisions, or just putting off essential maintenance.
Right. Deferred maintenance, that adds up.
Hugely.
Ugh.
And these losses, technical or non-technical, they have a massive cost for society. Utilities end up having to build extra power plants, bigger networks, just to cover the energy that gets wasted.
Which ultimately means higher electricity bills for, well, for you listening.
Exactly. And the goal here, as this study points out really well, isn't actually zero loss. I mean, that's physically impossible.
And probably incredibly expensive to even try.
Prohibitively expensive, yes. The real challenge, the engineering and economic puzzle, is optimization. You're trying to balance the ongoing cost of that wasted power against the, frankly, astronomical cost of building a near-perfect grid.
Finding the sweet spot.
Precisely. And that optimization problem, that's why this study is so important. Governments, big utilities, international banks, they all need reliable long-term forecasts. We're talking 20, 30, even 40 years out.
To make these huge investment decisions, yeah. So why weren't the existing tools, the standard engineering methods, up to this specific task, this global long-term forecasting?
Well, the traditional tools are excellent for their intended purpose, but they stumble at this kind of scale and time frame. Take optimal power flow, OPF.
Okay.
It's fantastic for calculating the ideal minimum loss in a network you know really well. But the catch is you need a complete detailed map of that network, every wire, every substation.
Which sounds difficult.
It's incredibly hard to get for one city, let alone trying to predict it for every country decades from now. It's just not feasible.
Right.
And there's another issue. OPF calculates the ideal. It doesn't really account for the messy reality of how grids operate day to day, especially now with more and more prosumers.
Okay, let's quickly define prosumers for everyone.
Good point. A prosumer is someone who both consumes electricity and produces it. Think rooftop solar panels or home battery systems.
Got it. So they're pushing power back onto the grid sometimes.
Exactly. And their production, their consumption, it's dynamic, it's less predictable. Thousands of these small fluctuating power sources make it really hard for a tool like OPF, which prefers predictable flows, to give accurate long-term global estimates.
Okay, so OPF is too detailed and idealized for this job. What about the other common method, just looking at past trends?
Statistical trends, yeah. They work okay for short-term planning, maybe the next 5 years or so.
But not decades out?
No. The further you project that trend line, the shakier it gets. The accuracy just plummets. If you need a forecast for 2050 to decide on building, say, a massive new transmission line, relying on a simple trend line is, well, it's risky.
So this leads us to the real breakthrough in this study, right? The researchers kind of sidestepped the whole technical data problem.
They did. It was a really clever pivot. They basically said, look, getting future technical grid data for 200 countries is impossible, but what do we have reliable long-term projections for?
And the answer wasn't engineering specs.
No, it was things like economic forecasts, demographic shifts, political stability metrics, things that international bodies already project decades ahead. So they asked, can we find strong correlations between these factors and the actual power losses we observe?
They swapped engineering data for socioeconomic data, essentially.
Exactly. And that swap allowed them to build a statistically solid prediction model using information that's actually available and regularly updated.
Okay, so they looked at a lot of potential factors. Which ones ended up being the key predictors in the final model?
After analyzing the data, they narrowed it down to 6 main factors. They fall into a few categories: economic, geographical, political, even climatic and organizational.
Okay, what are they?
Right. So, number 1, GDP per capita. 2, the Corruption Perception Index, or CPI. 3, the level of urbanization. 4, the physical area of the country. 5, temperature specifically, how many days go over 20 degrees Celsius.
Interesting. And the last one?
The last one is actually a pair of factors they created themselves, sort of proxies for grid management quality. They called them the grid organization parameters, GRID and GRID-FAIL.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. GDP per capita, that seems intuitive. Wealthier countries, better grids.
That's the basic idea, and the data backs it up strongly. They found an exponential relationship. As GDP per capita increases, T&D losses decrease significantly.
Yeah.
More money generally means better construction, better maintenance, stronger regulations.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This effect isn't infinite. The study found a ceiling, a threshold.
The threshold.
Yeah, around 40,000 euros per capita, roughly. Once a country's average income reaches that level, pouring more money specifically into the grid doesn't really reduce technical losses much further.
So beyond that point, you've kind of hit the point of diminishing returns for loss reduction through wealth alone. You're already near the technical optimum.
Pretty much. You might spend money for other reasons, reliability, capacity, but not purely to cut losses further in a big way.
That's a key insight. It means for developed economies, the path to lower losses isn't just about spending more. Now, if GDP is about the ability to build good grids, what about the Corruption Perception Index, the CPI? That sounds like it measures the integrity of how that money is used.
Absolutely. And this is where the study really highlights the impact of governance. They found a very clear, very strong exponential link here too, but in the other direction. Meaning higher perceived corruption, which is a lower CPI score, correlates exponentially with higher average T&D losses.
Wow, exponential again.
Yes. It strongly suggests that those non-technical losses we talked about, widespread energy theft, policies that lead to neglect, administrative bungling, these are heavily influenced by the political environment.
So bad governance literally shows up as wasted electricity?
Measurably so.
Yeah.
And they also found that countries with low CPI scores, high corruption, tend to have a much wider spread in their loss figures from year to year. More volatility, more uncertainty. Less corrupt countries have more predictable, stable, and lower losses.
Fascinating. Okay, what about urbanization? How does that play in?
That showed a fairly straightforward, linear trend. More urbanization generally means lower T&D losses.
Which makes engineering sense, I suppose. Denser networks.
Exactly. It's generally cheaper and more efficient to build and maintain a compact grid serving a city than it is to run long, sprawling lines across vast rural areas to serve fewer people. Less distance, less loss.
Speaking of vast areas, how did they handle countries like Russia or Canada? Just plugging in the total land area seems like it might skew things.
Good point. They recognize that. For those geographically enormous countries, only a fraction of the land is actually densely populated and electrified. So, using the total area wouldn't be representative of the grid itself.
So what did they do?
They put a cap on the area parameter in the model. They limited its influence at 100,000 square kilometers. Basically, beyond that size, the sheer area of the country stops being a primary driver of the national average loss rate.
Okay, that seems like a sensible adjustment. Now, let's go back to those two factors you mentioned they created GRID and GRID-FAIL. If the goal was to use non-technical, readily available data, why introduce these artificial parameters? It feels a bit like sneaking technical judgment back in.
That's a fair question. They needed a way to account for the quality of grid management and the existing infrastructure state without having detailed technical data for every country. These parameters act as proxies for that technological and organizational reality, but based on past performance rather than technical specs.
Okay, so how do they work? How do they assign a GRID or GRID-FAIL score?
It's based on a historical loss threshold. They use 15% as a rough dividing line. If a country historically had average losses below 15%, suggesting technical losses were likely the main component, it fell into the GRID category.
And above 15%.
If losses were consistently above 15%, suggesting significant non-technical issues like theft or major mismanagement were probably at play, it fell into the grid fail category.
So it's like a shorthand for, is this country managing its grid relatively effectively given its circumstances?
Hmm.
Grid means basically yes, grid fail means probably not.
That's a good way to put it. And crucially, these weren't just binary flags. They were weighted. A country's score was adjusted based on how far its actual losses were from the average expected loss for countries with similar GDP and CPI levels.
Ah, so it captures whether a country is overperforming or underperforming compared to its peers?
Exactly. It allowed the model to factor in the quality of power sector governance and existing infrastructure condition, giving a basis for projecting future improvements that might come from policy changes or crackdowns on theft, not just from getting richer.
Okay, that makes the logic clearer. So they built this model using GDP, corruption, urbanization, capped area, temperature, and these grid fail proxies. How well did it actually work? Did it match reality?
The performance was actually remarkably good, especially for a global model dealing with such complex variables. They calculated the coefficient of determination, R squared.
Which tells you how well the model fits the actual data, right?
Right, and they got an R squared of 0.93.
Wow, that's high. 1.0 is a perfect fit, so 0.93 is.
It's exceptionally strong. It means the model explains about 93% of the variation in global T&D losses using these factors. And they validated it too, checking its predictions against real data from 2010 to 2013. For about two-thirds of countries, 67%, the model's prediction was within 20% of the actual observed losses.
That gives us some confidence in looking at the future projections then. Let's talk case studies. What did the model predict for somewhere like Iran?
Iran is a good example of a country projected to see significant improvement. Based on expected economic development and organizational shifts, the model estimates Iran's T&D losses could fall from around 15% in 2010 to roughly 7.4% by 2050.
So almost halving their losses. That's a major efficiency gain.
A very significant potential improvement, yes, driven largely by those non-technical factors improving.
Now let's contrast that with, say, the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, already highly developed, low corruption.
Yeah, for them, the story is very different, as you'd expect. The model shows their losses staying pretty flat and already low, somewhere in the 4% to 7% range out to 2050.
Because they've already hit that GDP ceiling we talked about.
Exactly. They're already very wealthy, very well governed in this respect. They're bumping up against the practical minimum technical loss limit, which the study assumes is probably around 2% at best. So there's just not much room left for improvement driven by these factors.
So the small differences between them, say Finland versus Sweden.
That likely comes down to slightly different national strategies for grid investment and operation. The study notes Finland, for instance, might focus more explicitly on total life cycle costs, including the cost of losses, which could explain why their estimate is marginally lower. But fundamentally, they're all in that optimized low-loss band.
Okay, so developed countries, not much change expected. But the really dramatic prediction, the one that seems to hinge heavily on the political and organizational factors, was for India, wasn't it?
Absolutely. This is probably the standout example of the model's predictive power based on non-technical drivers. This study estimates a really steep decline in India's total T&D losses.
How steep?
From around 23% back in 2010, the model project's losses could fall all the way down to about 6% by 2050.
Wow. From 23% to 6%. That's a colossal improvement. What's driving that, according to the model? It can't just be new wires.
No, it's primarily driven by two key projected changes. First, continued strong GDP per capita growth. But second, and perhaps even more importantly, the model assumes a significant projected increase in India's CPI score.
Meaning a reduction in perceived corruption and presumably related issues like...
Like electricity theft. A major crackdown on non-technical losses is essentially baked into that projection, alongside economic growth.
Is there any real-world evidence to suggest that kind of massive drop is even possible?
Yes, and the study cites a great example. The Indian state of Karnataka undertook very aggressive power sector reforms, specifically targeting losses and improving efficiency.
And what happened?
Their losses reportedly fell from an astonishing 37.3% down to 11.5%. So while the model projects a national trend, this state-level example shows that such dramatic reductions are achievable through focused policy, organizational improvements, and tackling theft.
That really drives the point home. The core insight here seems to be that while developed countries might be nearing their technical limits, for a huge part of the world, countries currently losing 20, 30, maybe even 40% of their power, the biggest gains aren't just about engineering. They're about governance, economics, and organization.
That's precisely it. Political will, effective policy, tackling corruption and theft. These seem to be the most powerful levers for improving grid efficiency in many parts of the world going forward.
So this study gives us a powerful tool then. It's transparent, uses data that's actually trackable, and it lets us estimate current losses and future trends for literally every country
Oh, wow.
without needing impossible amounts of technical detail.
Exactly. It demonstrates you can get a remarkably clear picture of grid health and potential future health by looking at these broader socioeconomic and political factors.
It's a fantastic piece of work, really showing how linking different fields of data can unlock insights into huge infrastructure challenges. Just to remind everyone, the full title of the research we've been discussing is Power Transmission and Distribution's Losses, a model based on available empirical data and future trends for all countries globally.
And that, I think, leads us nicely to a final thought for you, our listeners.
That's
Well, if this study convincingly shows that things we often think of as purely political or economic, like corruption levels or GDP growth, have such a direct, measurable, and even predictive impact on something as technical sounding as power grid losses,
uh-huh.
then what other big infrastructure systems might be behaving the same way? Think about water management, internet access, maybe even transportation networks. Are the technical problems we see there also perhaps symptoms of deeper issues in governance or economic structure?
That's a really powerful question. How does that realization, if it holds true elsewhere, change how we should think about investing in infrastructure globally? Maybe sometimes the best investment isn't just pouring concrete or stringing wire.
Maybe sometimes it's investing in strengthening institutions,
Yeah,
improving transparency, or tackling corruption head-on.
definitely something to mull over. Food for thought until our next deep dive.